Atlantis was never lost. It was never even real, not the way you think of it, not the way 1,000 documentaries and just as many conspiracy channels have told it to you. There was no sudden cataclysm that swallowed a shining continent beneath the Atlantic Ocean. There was no advanced civilization of crystal engines and flying ships waiting to be rediscovered by a sufficiently determined treasure hunter. What there was, instead, is stranger and in its own way more interesting, a single philosopher, writing in Athens roughly 2,400 years ago, who invented a story to make a point about human nature, and then watched, from whatever vantage point the dead are granted, as that invented story outgrew him entirely, and became one of the most persistent and most misunderstood ideas in the history of the world. You may already sense the shape of what's coming, since almost everyone has heard some version of this legend, a perfect island civilization, wealthy beyond imagining, protected by rings of water and land, undone by its own pride, and swallowed by the sea in a single catastrophic night. What almost no one has actually done is sit with the original text, read what the philosopher who invented Atlantis actually wrote, and the actual words he chose, for the actual purpose he had in mind. Tonight, that's what you're going to do. Not the treasure hunter's Atlantis. Not the documentary Atlantis, breathlessly narrated over stock footage of coral reefs. The real one, the philosophical one, the textual one, the one hiding underneath 24 centuries of people wanting, quite badly, for it to be something it never claimed to be. So let yourself settle into this the way you would a long, unhurried conversation with someone who has spent a great deal of time with old books, shoulders down, mind loosening its grip on the day behind you. This is going to be a patient unraveling, not a reveal. If that kind of patient unraveling is something you find yourself returning to on other nights, there is a subscribe button near this video, worth pressing only if you actually find yourself coming back for more of this. No pressure in it either way. Because before you can understand why Atlantis refuses to die as an idea, you first have to understand exactly how, and precisely why, it was born. To understand Atlantis, you first have to understand the man who invented it, and the intellectual world he was writing inside of. A world that had a very different relationship with the line between fact and fiction than the one you likely take for granted. Plato lived in Athens from roughly 428 to 348 BCE. In the century following the city's golden age under Pericles and its bruising defeat in the Peloponnesian War against Sparta, a defeat that shaped nearly everything Plato wrote, since it left him, like many Athenian aristocrats of his generation, deeply suspicious of Athenian democracy and its capacity for wisdom, and deeply preoccupied with the question of what a genuinely well-ordered society might actually look like. Plato was a student of Socrates, the famous Athenian philosopher who wrote nothing down himself and was eventually executed by the city he had spent his life questioning, on charges of corrupting the youth and impiety toward the gods. Nearly everything we know of Socrates comes through the writings of his students, Plato chief among them, who preserved his teacher's memory not through straightforward biography but through dozens of dialogues. Invented conversations, staged as though transcribed from life, in which Socrates and various interlocutors argue their way toward philosophical conclusions about justice, knowledge, love, the soul, and the nature of the good society. Plato was not the only student to write this way. Several of his contemporaries, including Xenophon, another former student of Socrates, produced their own competing dialogues featuring the same teacher, often reaching different conclusions or emphasizing different sides of his personality. A reminder that even the historical Socrates himself reaches modern readers only through a layer of literary reconstruction, filtered through each author's own philosophical agenda rather than delivered as plain, unmediated, straightforward fact. This is the crucial habit of mind you need to hold onto as this account moves forward. Plato routinely invented stories, characters, and even entire mythical episodes to illustrate philosophical arguments. And he did this so often, and so openly, that ancient readers understood it as simply how Plato wrote. In the Republic, his most famous work, he tells the myth of air, an invented account of a soldier who dies, witnesses the afterlife and the mechanism by which souls choose their next incarnation, and returns to life to report what he saw, used entirely to illustrate a point about justice and reward rather than presented as an actual event. Elsewhere, in the same dialogue, he tells the story of the Ring of Gyges, an invented tale of a shepherd who finds a ring that grants invisibility, used to probe the question of whether people behave justly only because they fear getting caught. Neither story pretends, even slightly, to be a historical report. Both exist purely to make an argument land harder than dry logical prose alone could manage. Atlantis, as you're about to see, belongs to this same family of invented illustration, though it would go on to have a very different afterlife than the myth of air or the Ring of Gyges ever did, almost entirely because of two small but consequential differences in how Plato chose to frame it. He gave it, for the first time in his surviving work, specific geography, specific dates, and a specific chain of supposed transmission through real historical figures, details concrete enough that later readers, stripped of the philosophical context surrounding them, could mistake dressing for substance. To see exactly how that framing worked, you first need to meet the man Plato chose to tell the story, because the name he gave his narrator was not, for Plato's own original Athenian audience, a neutral choice. That narrator's name was Critias, and it was not invented from nothing the way Atlantis itself was. Critias was a real name, attached to real, well-known people in Plato's own family and in recent Athenian political memory, and which real Critias Plato had in mind when he wrote these two dialogues is a question scholars have argued over for well over a century, without ever reaching full agreement. The most notorious bearer of the name was Critias, a leading figure among the 30 tyrants, the brutal oligarchic regime that seized control of Athens in 404 BCE, in the immediate aftermath of the city's crushing defeat by Sparta at the end of the long Peloponnesian War. Installed with Spartan backing and ostensibly meant to reform Athenian law, the 30 instead conducted an 8-month reign of political terror, executing without trial an estimated 1,500 Athenian citizens, confiscating the property of many more, and driving thousands of others into exile. One of the darkest and most traumatic episodes in Athens' entire classical history, still raw in civic memory by the time Plato, writing decades later, sat down to compose the Timaeus and Critias. This Critias was, by most reconstructions of Plato's family tree, a first cousin of Plato's own mother, making the connection a matter of direct blood relation rather than mere coincidence of name. Some classical scholars argue the dialogue's narrator is meant to represent this same man, reasoning, in part, from the age and biographical details Plato attaches to the character, and from the historical Critias' own documented interest in exactly the kind of history and rhetoric Plato has him narrate at such length. Others argue Plato more likely intended an earlier relative, an elder Critias, a generation or two removed, remembered within the family as a friend of the great lawmaker Solon himself, which would explain More comfortably, how the Atlantis story supposedly passed down through family retelling in the first place, without requiring Plato's audience to sit through an account narrated, without any apparent irony, by a man many of them would have personally blamed for relatives lost to his own. Regime's purges. Plato's text itself is genuinely ambiguous on this point, likely deliberately so, and this account will not pretend to a certainty the historical record simply does not support. What is not ambiguous, whichever specific Critias Plato had in mind, is how directly this family history connects to the argument Atlantis exists to make. Plato had watched relatives of his own become instruments of exactly the kind of unchecked, corrupted power his invented island kings eventually succumbed to, men entrusted with restoring order to a wounded city, who instead used that trust to enrich themselves and terrorize their fellow citizens. He had watched, only a few years later, Athens' restored democracy respond to this trauma not with the kind of careful, reason-governed justice Plato spent his life arguing for, but by executing his own teacher, Socrates, on charges many ancient and modern readers alike have judged to be substantially a matter of political scapegoating rather than genuine wrongdoing. And decades after that, in the twilight of his own life, Plato would make two separate, increasingly desperate journeys to Syracuse and Sicily, attempting to personally tutor a young ruler, Dionysius II, toward the kind of philosophical, virtue-governed kingship the Republic describes in the abstract, journeys that ended not in triumph but in failure and political intrigue, with several ancient biographical traditions claiming Plato himself was briefly sold into slavery during one of these trips before being ransomed and returned home. Read against this biography, Atlantis' kings, men born with a genuine claim to divine wisdom and virtue, who nonetheless let that inheritance dissolve, generation after generation, into ordinary greed and appetite for power. Stop reading like an abstract cautionary fable about a hypothetical civilization, and start reading like something considerably closer to a personal reckoning, worked out at a careful philosophical distance, with people Plato had actually known. With that family history in view, it's time to turn to where the invented story itself actually begins in the text, the dialogue that introduces Atlantis to Plato's readers for the first time, the Timaeus. The Timaeus is, on the whole, one of the strangest and most technically demanding works Plato ever wrote, not a story about a lost island at all, but an extended cosmological treatise, in which a character named Timaeus delivers a long, dense speech attempting to explain the physical structure of the universe, the nature of the elements, the geometry underlying matter, the construction of the human body and soul, and the role of a divine craftsman, the demiurge, in shaping an orderly cosmos out of primordial chaos. If you went looking for Atlantis expecting an adventure story, the Timaeus would disappoint you almost immediately. Atlantis occupies only a small fraction of the dialogue, appearing near its beginning as what scholars generally call a frame story, a narrative device meant to set up and justify the cosmological lecture that follows. Here is how that framing actually works. The dialogue opens with Socrates recalling, the previous day, having described his vision of an ideal city-state, essentially a recap of the argument Plato had already made at length in the Republic, and expressing a wish to see that ideal city imagined not sitting still in abstract theory, but in motion, tested under the pressures of an actual war against a worthy opponent. Critias, one of the characters present, responds by saying he happens to know just the story, an account, he says, that he heard as a boy from his grandfather, who in turn heard it from the great Athenian lawmaker Solon, who in turn heard it from Egyptian priests during his travels to the city of Sais in Egypt, generations before. This chain of transmission deserves your close attention because it is doing very deliberate literary work. Solon was a genuine historical figure, an Athenian statesman and lawmaker who lived roughly 2 centuries before Plato and who was widely credited with foundational legal reforms in Athens. Invoking his name lends the coming story an air of documented history rather than invented fable, the same rhetorical trick a modern writer might use by claiming a tale came from an old family diary rather than simply admitting they made it up. According to Critias, the Egyptian priests told Solon that the Greeks were, in their memory, essentially children, a people with no ancient records of their own, because periodic natural catastrophes, floods and fires, had repeatedly wiped their civilization's collective memory clean, while Egypt, protected by the steady flooding of the Nile rather than destroyed by it, had preserved written records reaching back thousands of years further than anything the Greeks themselves could recall. Among those ancient Egyptian records, the priests claimed, was an account of a war fought some 9,000 years before Solon's own time, a war between the earliest Athenians, whose own city, the priests insisted, had once been the most excellent and best-governed society in existence, and a vast, aggressive island empire called Atlantis, which lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar, out in the open Atlantic Ocean. Ancient Athens, according to this account, single-handedly defeated Atlantis's invading forces before both civilizations were destroyed by natural catastrophe, Athens buried and its people scattered. Atlantis sunk entirely beneath the sea in a single terrible day and night. It is a striking detail, easy to miss on a first read, that this famous image, the island vanishing beneath the waves in a day and a night, actually appears here, in the Timaeus, as a brief summary near the beginning of the whole account, well before the fuller, more detailed description of Atlantis itself, which Plato saves for a second, separate dialogue, the Critias. Where the Timaeus mentions Atlantis only briefly, as a setup for its cosmological main event, the dialogue that Plato apparently intended as its sequel, named, appropriately, the Critias, after the character who narrates it, turns almost entirely to Atlantis itself, describing the island, its people, its government, and its wealth in far greater and far stranger detail than the earlier dialogue ever attempted. It is in the Critias that you find the elaborate description of concentric rings, the palace of Poseidon, the 10 kings, and the mysterious metal called Orichalcum that later chapters of this account will walk through carefully. But before getting to any of that content, there's a fact about the Critias itself that deserves attention first, because it is one of the single most important clues bearing on the question of whether Plato intended any of this to be read as history. There's a further, almost eerie layer to this theme of incompleteness, one Plato includes directly in his own text rather than leaving for later readers to notice. Within the dialogue itself, Critias mentions that Solon, upon returning to Athens with the story from Egypt, had intended to turn it into a proper epic poem of his own, in the grand tradition of Homer and Hesiod, but never completed the project. Distracted, Critias explains, by the political turmoil that consumed the final years of Solon's life, and eventually overtaken by old age before he ever finished more than a beginning. The story of Atlantis, in other words, arrives to us as an account of an unfinished poem, retold within an unfinished dialogue, by an author who left the whole project without its intended concluding volume. An almost unsettling pattern of incompleteness stacked on incompleteness, running through every layer of the text's own claimed history. The Critias itself is, in fact, unfinished in exactly this same way. It does not conclude with a tidy summary or a philosophical lesson drawn out explicitly, the way many of Plato's other dialogues do. It simply stops, mid-sentence, in the middle of a scene in which the god Zeus, having observed the moral decline of the once virtuous Atlantean kings, gathers the other gods in council to decide what punishment the corrupted island deserves. Zeus opens his mouth to speak. The text tells us he addressed the assembled gods, and then nothing. The manuscript ends there. No description of the punishment survives, no account of the actual sinking of the island in the detailed narrative sense, no closing moral delivered in Plato's own authorial voice. Whatever climactic scene Plato intended to write, whether he abandoned it deliberately or simply never returned to finish it before his death, is lost to us entirely. And scholars have debated the reason for centuries without reaching any firm consensus. This incompleteness matters enormously to how you should read everything that follows in this account, and it's worth sitting with for a moment rather than rushing past. Plato appears to have planned the Timaeus, the Critias, and a third dialogue called the Hermocrates as a connected trilogy, working through his ideas about the ideal state, its founding myth, and its trial by war and time. The Hermocrates was apparently never written at all. The Critias was abandoned partway through. What survives of the Atlantis story, in other words, is not a completed narrative that Plato considered finished and ready for the world, but an unfinished philosophical sketch, a working draft of an illustration, interrupted before its author ever brought it to a close. That is not, on its own, decisive proof that Plato invented the story rather than reporting a real tradition. But it is a strange thing to find at the heart of what later readers would insist on treating as a precise historical record, complete with exact dates, exact measurements, and exact descriptions of a civilization no other ancient source ever mentions. With that caveat firmly in place, it's worth actually walking through what the unfinished Critias does describe, because the level of specific, almost obsessive detail Plato lavishes on an island he may never have intended anyone to take literally is, in its own way, part of what makes this story so remarkable. According to the Critias, Atlantis was, before its fall, larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, a genuinely enormous landmass situated in the Atlantic Ocean beyond the Pillars of Heracles, with a chain of smaller islands beyond it leading toward an even larger continent on the far side of the ocean, a detail some later readers have found intriguingly suggestive of the Americas, though nothing in the text supports that reading as anything more than coincidence or, at most, deliberate cosmic scale setting on Plato's part. At the center of this great island stood a smaller hill, not far from the coast, and a wide and fertile plain, and it was here that the island's origin story begins. The sea god Poseidon, according to Critias' account, fell in love with a mortal woman named Cleito, who lived alone on this central hill with her parents, the only inhabitants of the otherwise unpopulated island. To protect her, Poseidon enclosed the hill with alternating rings of water and land, 3 rings of sea and 2 rings of earth, arranged in perfect concentric circles around the central hill like the rings of a target, each ring accessible from the next only by narrow channels cut through the land rings and bridged with structures wide enough for chariots and processions to cross. Poseidon fathered 10 sons with Cleito, born as 5 sets of twins, and divided the island and its surrounding territory among them, establishing the royal line that would govern Atlantis for generations to come. The eldest of these 10 sons, named Atlas, became the first king of Atlantis and ruled the central region containing the capital city itself, and it is from his name, deliberately, Critias tells us, that both the Atlantic Ocean and the island of Atlantis itself took their names, a small etymological flourish that is itself worth noticing. since it reveals Plato reaching for the same kind of invented but plausible-sounding origin story that mythmakers across many cultures have used to explain how places got their names. The other 9 sons became kings of the outlying regions and the broader Atlantic territories under Atlantean control, forming a confederation of 10 linked kingdoms, bound together by shared descent from Poseidon and, as later chapters of the Critias describe, by a formal alliance sworn periodically at the temple built at the island's center. Around this central hill and its rings of water and land, Critias describes an outer plain of almost unbelievable regularity, a vast rectangular expanse, he claims, measuring roughly 2,000 stadia by 3,000 stadia, figures modern scholars generally convert to something in the range of 200 by 300 miles. Surrounded by mountains on 3 sides and open to the sea on the 4th, crossed by an enormous engineered canal system of perfectly straight irrigation. Channels dividing the plain into a precise grid, each section assigned its own agricultural quota and military levy. It is a description that reads, in long stretches, less like a travelogue and more like an idealized engineering proposal. A civilization imagined with the geometric tidiness of someone designing a system on paper rather than describing a place they had actually walked through. A stylistic detail that later chapters of this account will return to when weighing the case for Atlantis as literary invention rather than historical memory. Atlantis's power, and Critias' telling, was never confined to the island itself. The 10 kings and their confederation held dominion over a wide arc of subject territories stretching across the Atlantic and, according to the brief summary given earlier in the Timaeus, extended their reach into the Mediterranean world as far as Egypt on one side and a region called Tyranny, roughly corresponding to parts of the Italian peninsula, on the other, before their final overreaching war against Athens and the rest of Greece brought that expansion to its catastrophic end. This detail matters for understanding the scale Plato was working with. Atlantis is not described as a modestly sized regional power with a colorful capital city, but as something closer to a hemispheric empire, its reach spanning 2 oceans worth of coastline, ruled from a single ceremonial center barely larger, in relative terms, than a single wealthy Greek city-state. That gap between the empires described geographic reach and the intimate, almost provincial scale of its actual governing ceremonies, 10 kings, 1 temple, 1 shared ritual meal, is itself one of the many internal tensions later readers have pointed to when arguing that Critias' Atlantis reads more like an imaginative composite, built to impress rather than to cohere as a plausible functioning state, than like a genuine geopolitical memory. At the center of all these concentric rings stood the city itself, and Critias describes it with a level of architectural detail that goes well beyond anything Plato bothers to include in his descriptions of real historical places elsewhere in his writing, a fact that, on its own, should tell you something about how much imaginative energy Plato poured into this particular invention. The innermost island, where Clyto's original home had stood, held the royal palace and the island's 2 most sacred temples, one dedicated jointly to Poseidon and Clyto, enclosed by a golden wall and forbidden to ordinary visitors, and a second, larger temple dedicated to Poseidon alone, its exterior entirely covered in silver, its pinnacles capped in gold, its ceiling worked in ivory, gold, silver, and the mysterious reddish metal called Orichalcum, which the next chapter of this account will look at more closely. Inside this temple to Poseidon stood a colossal statue of the god himself, so large it touched the roof of the building, depicted standing in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses, surrounded by 100 sculpted sea nymphs riding dolphins, an image of almost cinematic grandeur that reads more like something out of a later fantasy epic than a sober historical description. And deliberately so, since Critias is explicitly building toward a portrait of a civilization defined by superlative, almost excessive abundance in every direction. Around the temple stood statues of all 10 original kings and their wives, along with countless offerings brought by the kings and citizens of Atlantis and its subject territories over generations, making the temple's precinct, and Critias telling, one of the wealthiest single sites in the ancient world. The rings of water surrounding the central island were connected to one another and to the open sea by a great canal, wide and deep enough for the largest warships of the era to pass through fully loaded, running in a straight line from the outermost ring directly out to the coast, a piece of maritime infrastructure that would represent, even by modern engineering standards, an extraordinary undertaking, and one that Critias describes as merely one feature among many rather than as the singular marvel it would actually represent if built. Along the rings of land stood the city's residential districts, shipyards, and harbors, described as perpetually crowded with vessels and merchants arriving from every part of the known world, drawn by the wealth of goods Atlantis produced and imported in equal, staggering abundance. The island's natural resources, and Critias telling, matched its architectural splendor, forests supplying every kind of timber needed for construction and shipbuilding, springs of both hot and cold water feeding elaborate public and private baths, fertile soil supporting 2 harvests each year, and wildlife including, notably, a substantial population of elephants. A detail that has puzzled and intrigued readers for centuries, since it is exactly the kind of concrete, oddly specific claim that sounds like it should mean something, while resisting any confident historical explanation. Whether the elephants are meant as a genuine claim about Atlantic megafauna, an echo of the real elephants Plato's contemporaries knew existed in North Africa and parts of Asia, or simply one more brushstroke in a portrait designed to convey a civilization possessing literally everything a society could want, the text itself offers no clarification, and that, as this account will keep returning to, is very much the point of how Critias' description works throughout, comprehensive, specific, and ultimately unverifiable. Among all the specific details Critias includes in his description of Atlantis, none has captured later imaginations quite as thoroughly as Orichalcum, a metal Critias describes as having once been mined across the island in great quantities, valued in ancient times as second only to gold, and glowing, in his description, with a reddish, fiery brilliance that made it especially prized for decorating temples, palaces, and the great defensive walls surrounding each ring of the city. The word itself, Orichalcum, derives from Greek roots meaning roughly mountain copper or mountain bronze, and it did not originate with Plato. The term appears in other ancient Greek sources as well, generally understood to refer either to a genuine, if now imprecisely identified, copper alloy, or to brass, which was a relatively novel and highly prized metal in the ancient Mediterranean world during the period when Plato was writing. This is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it illustrates something important about how Plato constructed the entire Atlantis narrative. He didn't invent every single element from nothing. He took real words, real geographic references, real historical names, and wove them together with wholly invented details in a way calculated to feel plausible to an educated Athenian audience, the same way a skilled modern writer of historical fiction might build an invented plot around real place names and real customs to lend it texture and credibility. Orichalcum sat in exactly this space, familiar enough as a word that Plato's audience would recognize it as a real category of valuable metal, exotic enough in its specific Atlantean application, lining entire temple walls and city fortifications in quantities no real ancient economy could plausibly sustain, that it read as a marker of impossible, almost mythical wealth rather than a claim about ordinary trade goods. Modern archaeology has, in fact, turned up a genuine physical example of the metal Greek and Roman writers called Orichalcum, and it's worth a brief mention here, since it illustrates just how grounded in real material culture Plato's invented luxury actually was. In 2015, marine archaeologists excavating a 6th century BCE shipwreck off the southern coast of Sicily, near the city of Gela, recovered several dozen metal ingots that laboratory analysis identified as an alloy of copper, zinc, and small amounts of nickel, lead, and iron. A composition matching ancient descriptions of Orichalcum closely enough that Italian researchers publicly described the find using that same ancient name. The ingots were almost certainly bound for a workshop somewhere in the Greek world, intended for casting into decorative objects or coinage rather than anything resembling Plato's temple walls, and they represent, at most, an ordinary cargo of valuable trade metal rather than any confirmation of Atlantis itself. But the find is a useful reminder of the larger pattern this account keeps returning to. Plato's invention was built from real materials, real words, and real economic realities of his own era, reassembled at a scale and in a context no genuine 6th century shipment of metal ingots could ever have matched. Beyond Orichalcum, Critias catalogs Atlantis's wealth with the thoroughness of someone building an inventory rather than telling a story, abundant harvests of grain and fruit, herds of livestock large enough to sustain both agriculture and elaborate ritual sacrifice, an extensive trade network bringing in goods from across the known world, and craftsmen and artisans supported by the surplus this abundance generated, producing everything from ordinary household goods to the elaborate temple decorations described in the previous chapter of this account. Even the island's dining customs receive attention. Critias describes communal meals shared among the 10 kings and their households in a specially designated hall within the temple precinct, governed by careful protocol and elaborate purification rituals performed before any major decision affecting the whole confederation. Taken together, this relentless cataloging of wealth and abundance is doing real philosophical work, even if it can read, on first encounter, like simple extravagant fantasy. Plato is establishing, in exhaustive and deliberate detail, that Atlantis possessed every material advantage a civilization could conceivably want: resources, technology, fertile land, favorable geography, divine favor through its descent from Poseidon himself, precisely so that the story he tells in the chapters ahead about what ultimately happened to a society possessing all of that would land with the full philosophical weight he intended. A civilization that fails despite having nothing is not, after all, a very interesting cautionary tale. A civilization that fails despite having everything is a considerably sharper one. The government of Atlantis, as Critias describes it, was built around the 10 royal lines descended from Poseidon's original sons, each ruling their own territory within the broader Atlantic Confederation, with the king descended from Atlas, ruler of the central island and the capital city itself, holding a position of seniority among equals rather than absolute authority over the other 9. This structure, a kind of federated kingship bound by shared ancestry and formal oath rather than centralized imperial control, reflects concerns Plato explores at much greater length elsewhere in his political writing, particularly in the Republic and the later Laws, both of which wrestle repeatedly with the question of how to prevent any single ruler or faction from accumulating enough unchecked power to corrupt the wider system. Periodically, according to Critias, the 10 kings would gather at the temple of Poseidon to renew their alliance and adjudicate any disputes that had arisen between their territories. In a ceremony described in considerable ritual detail, the capture and ritual sacrifice of a bull using only wooden clubs and nooses rather than metal weapons, the mixing of the bull's blood into a ceremonial bowl of wine, and a solemn oath sworn by each king to govern according to the laws inscribed by their ancestors on a pillar of Orichalcum standing within the temple precinct, laws that, among other provisions, forbade any one royal line from making war against another without the unanimous consent of the full assembly of kings. It is a detailed, almost legalistic description of a constitutional check on royal power, and scholars who read the Critias primarily as political philosophy rather than proto-fantasy fiction tend to find this section especially telling, since it mirrors, in miniature, exactly the kind of institutional safeguard against tyranny that Plato spends enormous energy designing in his more overtly political dialogues, particularly in his later work The Laws, which similarly obsesses over how to structure a government that can resist decay across successive generations of rulers. The military capacity Critias attributes to this confederation is staggering by any ancient standard and described with the same numerical specificity found throughout the dialogue. Each of the plains' agricultural divisions, he claims, was required to supply a fixed quota of soldiers, chariots, cavalry, and warships toward the Confederation's combined forces, adding up, across the entire island and its dependent territories, to a military machine numbering in the hundreds of thousands of men. And well over 1,000 warships, an army and navy considerably larger than any force the actual ancient Mediterranean world, including the Persian Empire at its height, is known to have fielded. This numerical excess is, again, unlikely to be an accident or a simple failure of restraint on Plato's part. It sets up the central dramatic reversal the whole story exists to deliver, that this overwhelming, seemingly unstoppable military force, drawn from the wealthiest and most powerful civilization the world had ever known, was nonetheless defeated by a considerably smaller, poorer, but more disciplined and more virtuous army, the earliest Athenians. Exactly the kind of well-ordered, philosophically sound society Plato spends the Republic constructing in the abstract. The Orichalcum pillar standing at the center of Poseidon's temple, mentioned briefly in an earlier chapter of this account, carried more than the king's oath of alliance. Critias describes it as bearing the Confederation's actual body of law, along with a specific inscribed judgment reserved for any king who broke that law, death, decided upon by a majority vote of the assembled kings, with no exceptions carved out for rank or lineage, not even for the senior line descended from Atlas himself. Disputes between individual kingdoms that fell short of outright treason were to be settled by the same assembly, meeting inside the temple precinct under the god's watching statue, with each king bound beforehand by solemn oath to abide by whatever the majority decided, rather than pursuing the matter through his own private force of arms. It is, again, a strikingly careful piece of constitutional design for what modern readers often approach as a simple fantasy of excess, a system built, on paper, with real structural safeguards against exactly the kind of unilateral abuse of power that the story's later chapters describe the kings eventually falling into anyway, once the wealth and appetite driving them outgrew even a well-designed law's capacity to restrain it. That reversal, vast material power losing to smaller but morally superior discipline, sits at the exact philosophical center of why Plato invented Atlantis in the first place. And it matters that you understand it fully before you go any further into the story of the island's eventual downfall. For many generations, Critias tells us, the kings of Atlantis governed wisely and well, bound by genuine virtue rather than mere obligation to the laws their ancestors had established. Valuing wisdom and their partnership with the divine portion of their nature, the literal inheritance of godhood passed down from their descent from Poseidon over the pursuit of wealth for its own sake, even as that wealth continued to accumulate around them in vast quantities. They regarded their considerable material possessions, and Critias telling, as something to be used in service of virtue rather than something to be clung to or worshipped, and understood correctly that unchecked greed for gold and property tends to unravel the bonds that hold a genuinely good society together. But this state of grace did not last. Generation after generation, the kings of Atlantis intermarried with mortal humans rather than maintaining closer ties to their divine ancestry, and with each successive generation, Critias explains, the portion of divinity in their blood grew steadily more diluted, until human nature, with its ordinary human appetites for wealth, status, and unchecked power, gained the upper hand over whatever inherited wisdom and restraint their descent from Poseidon had originally provided. The text is explicit and unambiguous about what happened next. The kings of Atlantis, having lost the ballast of genuine virtue that had once anchored their tremendous power, grew corrupt. They became greedy, unjust, and full of what the Greeks called hubris, an excessive, overreaching pride that, throughout Greek literature and myth, reliably precedes and provokes divine punishment. Convinced of their own invincibility and entitled to whatever they wanted by virtue of their wealth and might, they turned their vast military machine outward, launching an unprovoked war of conquest against the peoples of the Mediterranean world, extending their control across much of what is now Europe and North Africa, and ultimately marching against Athens and the rest of Greece itself. It was here, according to the brief summary given earlier in the Timaeus, that ancient Athens, smaller, poorer, lacking anything remotely approaching Atlantis's material resources, but governed, in Plato's telling, by genuine virtue, discipline, and the well-ordered social structure he describes at length in the Republic, stood essentially alone after its allies abandoned the fight, and nonetheless defeated the vastly larger Atlantean invasion force through sheer excellence of character and civic virtue. And then, in the aftermath of this victory, catastrophe struck both sides at once, violent earthquakes and floods over the course of a single terrible day and night. Ancient Athens' own army was swallowed into the earth. Atlantis itself, with all its wealth, its 10 royal lines, its temples of gold and orichalcum, and its impossible engineered rings of land and sea, sank entirely beneath the ocean, vanishing so completely and so suddenly that, in Critias' account, the sea in that region became impassable afterward, choked with mud and shoals left behind by the sunken landmass. A detail some later readers have connected, likely coincidentally, to the genuine navigational hazards Atlantic sailors of Plato's era encountered near the Sargasso Sea, far beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. It is exactly at this point in the narrative, the moment Zeus, appalled by Atlantis' corruption, begins to address the assembled gods about what punishment the island deserves, that the Critias breaks off unfinished, as an earlier chapter of this account already described. Whatever fuller account of divine judgment and destruction Plato may have intended to write was never completed, leaving the version of the Atlantis myth that has come down through 24 centuries oddly and tellingly, without its own author's final word on what it all was supposed to mean. Having walked through what Atlantis actually was, according to the only ancient source that ever described it in any detail, it's time to step back and ask the question this entire account has been quietly building toward. Why did Plato write this story at all, and what was he actually trying to accomplish by inventing it? The answer sits, fairly plainly, in the philosophical project both dialogues explicitly announce themselves as serving, and understanding it changes almost everything about how you should read the details this account has just spent several chapters describing. Recall how the Timaeus opens, with Socrates recalling his description, the previous day, of an ideal city-state, and expressing a wish to see that ideal city imagined in motion, tested against a genuine external threat, behaving as an actual political community would under the pressure of real events, rather than sitting static as an abstract philosophical model. Critias' story of ancient Athens defeating Atlantis is offered explicitly, within the dialogue's own internal logic, as an answer to exactly this request. Ancient Athens, in Critias' account, is not simply a historical curiosity. It is presented as a working demonstration of the very ideal society Plato had spent the Republic constructing through abstract argument, now given a concrete narrative body, a specific enemy to face, and a specific triumph to win, all wrapped in genuinely impressive imaginative detail. Atlantis, in this framework, exists purely to serve as ancient Athens' dramatic foil, a civilization built with every conceivable material and military advantage, and defeated anyway. Specifically because material advantage divorced from virtue and wisdom is fundamentally hollow and, in Plato's moral universe, ultimately self-destructive. This is a theme Plato returns to constantly across his body of work, the conviction that a well-ordered soul, and by extension a well-ordered society, depends on reason and virtue governing appetite and ambition, rather than the reverse, and that societies which invert this order, however wealthy, however powerful, however impressive on the surface, inevitably decay from within. Exactly as Atlantis' kings decayed once their diluted divine inheritance stopped restraining their appetites. The staggering wealth, the elephants, the Orichalcum, the concentric rings of gold-plated temples, all of it exists to make the eventual moral point land with maximum force. Here is a civilization that had everything and lost everything, precisely because having everything was never actually the thing that mattered. There's a further clue worth noticing here, one that connects Atlantis directly back to Plato's broader political philosophy rather than treating it as an isolated flight of fancy. The structure of Atlantean government, a confederation of kings bound by oath, sworn to govern by ancestral law, explicitly warned against the corrupting influence of unchecked wealth and power, mirrors, almost point for point, the kinds of institutional safeguards Plato spends enormous energy designing in his more overtly political dialogues. Atlantis is not simply a monster story about greed. It is, in a very real sense, a failed utopia, a society built with genuinely thoughtful constitutional safeguards that nonetheless collapsed anyway, once the underlying human material governing that constitution stopped living up to it. That is a considerably more sophisticated and more unsettling argument than greed is bad, and it is very much the argument Plato appears to have actually intended. None of this, it's worth being direct about, proves with absolute certainty that Plato invented every detail from nothing, with no basis whatsoever in any older tradition he might have encountered. But taken together, the invented story habits evident throughout Plato's other work, the deliberate philosophical framing explicitly announced at the start of the Timaeus, the almost too perfect thematic fit between Atlantis' fall and Plato's recurring arguments about virtue and political decay, and the unfinished, working draft quality of the Critias itself. The case for reading Atlantis as philosophical invention rather than garbled historical memory is, by this point, already substantial. Before turning to the additional evidence beyond Plato's own texts, though, it's useful to look at just how deliberately this argument connects to Plato's other, far better-known political writing. Because the resemblance, as the next chapter will show, is considerably closer than a passing thematic echo. The resemblance here is not a loose thematic echo. It is close enough that many classicists read Atlantis as, among other things, a narrative dramatization of one of the Republic's central political arguments, given flesh, geography, and a fittingly spectacular ending. In Book 4 of the Republic, Plato lays out his theory of the tripartite soul, the claim that every human mind contains three distinct governing forces: reason, which seeks truth and genuine understanding; spirit, or thumos, which seeks honor, courage, and righteous indignation; and appetite, which seeks food, wealth, physical pleasure, and material accumulation generally. A just and well-ordered soul, in Plato's account, is one in which reason governs the other two, with spirit acting as reason's ally in maintaining discipline over appetite's endless demands. A corrupted soul, by direct contrast, is one in which appetite has slipped its leash entirely and now governs the whole person. Reason reduced to little more than a clever servant helping appetite get whatever it currently wants. Plato argues, at real length, that exactly the same structure governs entire political communities, not just individual minds. A just city is one governed by its most reason-driven citizens, its philosopher guardians, while an unjust city is one that has let appetite for wealth, status, or pleasure seize the reins of collective decision-making. This is precisely the failure that overtakes Atlantis's kings, translated from psychological theory into narrative event. For generations, Critias tells us, reason and virtue, inherited, quite literally in the story's own terms, through the king's partial divinity, governed their relationship to Atlantis's staggering material wealth. Then, as that divine inheritance diluted through repeated intermarriage with ordinary mortals, appetite gained the upper hand. Precisely as Plato's Republic warns it eventually will end any political community that fails to actively guard against it. The kings stopped treating their wealth as a tool in service of virtue and started treating it as the entire point. Hubris, greed, and the unprovoked war of conquest that follows are not separate plot developments loosely connected to this earlier moral collapse and Plato's own psychological framework. They are its direct and practically inevitable symptoms. The Republic goes even further, in a passage worth knowing directly, because it maps onto Atlantis's specific downfall with almost uncomfortable precision. Plato's ideal city requires its ruling guardian class to live under a strict and deliberately austere set of conditions: no private property beyond bare necessity, no personal gold or silver, communal meals and communal housing, specifically because Plato argues that direct, ongoing exposure to private wealth will corrupt even the most carefully educated and naturally virtuous rulers if given enough time and enough generations to work on them. Guardians who are permitted to accumulate private fortunes, Plato warns, will inevitably stop ruling in the interest of the whole city and start ruling in their own material interest instead. Precisely, point for point, the trajectory Atlantis's kings follow, as their communal oath-bound governance at the Temple of Poseidon, described in an earlier chapter of this account, gradually gives way to individual greed and unchecked ambition once the wealth pouring into their kingdom stops being treated as something to be stewarded and starts being treated as something to be kept. Plato returns to this same warning yet again in Book 8 of the Republic, where he sketches an entire theoretical cycle of political decay, his best regime, aristocracy, ruled by the most virtuous and wise. Degenerates first into timocracy, ruled by those who love honor and military glory more than wisdom, which in turn degenerates into oligarchy, ruled by the wealthy. Once love of honor is fully displaced by love of money, oligarchy then breeds enough resentment and inequality to collapse into democracy, which Plato regards as unstable in its own right, and democracy, finally, collapses into tyranny, as a demagogue exploits democratic freedom's excesses to seize absolute personal power. Atlantis's fall compresses this entire multi-stage cycle into a single, more mythic image, a slide from virtuous, oath-bound aristocratic rule directly into wealth-corrupted hubris and unprovoked war. But the underlying diagnosis is identical in both works. Political decay, in Plato's considered view, is not primarily a matter of external military threat or bad luck. It is what naturally happens, given enough time, to any community of humans that stops actively, structurally protecting its governing class from the corrupting effect of unearned wealth and unchecked appetite. With that fuller philosophical picture in view, Atlantis read not as an isolated fable but as one part of an argument Plato makes across his entire body of political writing. It's finally time to turn to the evidence beyond Plato's own texts. The evidence scholars have long pointed to when arguing that this whole richly constructed story was never intended to be read as literal history in the first place. Beyond the internal evidence of Plato's own philosophical intentions, there is a considerable body of external evidence that historians and classicists have pointed to for centuries when arguing that Atlantis, as described in the Timaeus and Critias, was never intended, and never functioned, as a literal historical record. This evidence deserves a direct walkthrough, since it forms the actual scholarly foundation beneath what this account has been calling, throughout, the case for reading Atlantis as invention. The most basic and perhaps the most decisive piece of evidence is simply this: no source earlier than Plato mentions Atlantis at all. Not Homer, whose epics preserve enormous amounts of older Greek legend and geography. Not Hesiod, whose work on divine genealogy and cosmic history would be exactly the kind of text to preserve a memory this dramatic, had one existed. And critically, not Herodotus, the great 5th century BCE historian and traveler often called the father of history, who wrote extensively and in considerable detail about Egypt, including first-hand descriptions of the very city of Sais where Solon supposedly learned the Atlantis story from Egyptian priests, and who described Sais's temples, its religious customs, and its historical records at length, without ever once mentioning any tradition resembling Atlantis. Herodotus is precisely the kind of thorough, curious, note-taking traveler who would almost certainly have recorded such a striking tale had it been circulating among Egyptian priestly traditions before Plato wrote it down, and his silence, given how closely his known travels overlap with the exact setting Critias claims for the story's origin, weighs heavily against the idea that Plato was simply reporting an older tradition rather than inventing a new one. The dates and measurements Critias provides create further, more mathematical problems. 9,000 years before Solon's own lifetime, which places the war between ancient Athens and Atlantis at roughly 9,600 BCE, falls well before the invention of writing. Well before the founding of any Bronze Age Mediterranean civilization archaeology has ever identified, and deep into a period when human societies across the region were, by every available archaeological measure, small-scale hunter-gatherer communities entirely incapable of building the kind of monumental, technologically sophisticated civilization Critias describes on either side of the conflict. The geography, too, resists any straightforward literal reading. Critias places Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles, out in the Atlantic Ocean, as a landmass larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, and no such landmass, sunken or otherwise, has ever been located in the Atlantic through the extensive modern seafloor mapping conducted over the past century, mapping thorough enough that a land area of that scale, if it had existed and sunk within the last several thousand years, would almost certainly have left detectable geological traces. Ancient readers themselves were divided on how seriously to take the story, and their disagreement is itself instructive. According to the later Neoplatonist commentator Proclus, writing several centuries after Plato, the early Platonist scholar Crantor reportedly treated the Atlantis account as genuine history and claimed to have traveled to Egypt himself to verify it against inscribed records the priests supposedly still possessed, though this claim survives only second-hand, through Proclus's much later commentary, and modern scholars generally treat it with considerable caution rather than as reliable confirmation. On the other side of the debate, the historian and geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century BCE, reports that Aristotle, Plato's own student, who studied directly under him for 2 decades at the academy and would have had about as much insight into his teacher's intentions as anyone in antiquity, dismissed Atlantis as pure invention, reportedly remarking that the same man who invented the island had also, conveniently, destroyed it, a dry observation pointing directly at the unfinished, philosophically self-serving structure of Plato's own narrative. One further piece of evidence, less dramatic than the others but still notable, comes from how modern scholars date the Timaeus and Critias within Plato's own body of work. Stylistic and linguistic analysis of Plato's Greek prose, comparing sentence rhythm, vocabulary, and other measurable features across his securely dated dialogues, places both works among his latest writings, composed in the final decade or so of his life, around the same period as his considerably longer and more explicitly technical political treatise, The Laws. This matters because it undercuts one tempting but ultimately unsupported reading of Atlantis, the idea that it might represent an early, less disciplined flight of imaginative fancy from a younger Plato, before he settled into more rigorous philosophical habits. The stylistic evidence points the other way entirely. Atlantis was composed by Plato at the height of his mature political thinking, working on the same philosophical problems that occupy the Laws, which makes the close thematic overlap between Atlantis's downfall and the Republic and Laws' warnings about wealth and political decay considerably harder to write off as coincidence. There's one further detail worth adding here, since it fits the same pattern this account has already traced with Orichalcum. Even the name Atlantic Ocean itself was not, strictly speaking, Plato's own invention, whatever Critias' account claims about its origin. Greek writers, including Herodotus a century before Plato, already used a closely related term, the Atlantis Sea, to describe the ocean beyond the Pillars of Heracles, deriving it from Atlas, the titan of older Greek myth condemned to hold up the sky, whose name was also already attached to the Atlas Mountains along the northwest African coastline nearby. Critias claimed that the ocean and the island both took their names from Atlantis's own first king in other words, almost certainly Plato reverse engineering a new mythological explanation for a geographic name his audience already used and already associated with an entirely different, older myth. The same move this account has already observed with Orichalcum, taking something real and familiar and giving it fresh, invented significance within his own story. Taken together, this body of evidence, the total absence of any pre-Platonic source, the archaeologically impossible dates, the geographically unverifiable location, the skepticism voiced by Plato's own most gifted student, the dialogue's own place within Plato's mature philosophical output, and Plato's habit of repurposing already existing names and words for his own invented mythology, represents the mainstream position among modern classicists and historians that Atlantis, as Plato described it, was a philosophical thought experiment dressed in the convincing clothing of historical narrative, not a garbled memory of any real lost civilization. That conclusion, however, raises an obvious and considerably more interesting question, one this account will spend much of its remaining time exploring. If Atlantis was never real, why did so many people across so many centuries insist, and continue to insist, that it was? You might reasonably expect that a story explicitly framed by its own author as an illustrative fable, embedded within an unmistakably philosophical text, would have been read that way from the start. It largely was not, and the reasons why offer an early, revealing preview of exactly the psychological pull this entire account will return to again and again as it moves forward through the centuries. Even in antiquity, as the previous chapter described, opinion was already divided. Crantor's reported claim to have personally verified the Atlantis story against Egyptian records, however second-hand and unreliable that claim reaches us today, shows that literal belief in Atlantis was circulating among educated readers within just a few generations of Plato's death, not centuries later once the story had drifted far from its philosophical origins. Part of what made this literal reading so tempting from the very beginning was precisely the concrete specificity this account has spent so much time cataloging: real place names, a plausible sounding chain of transmission through a genuine historical figure in Solon, exact measurements, exact dates, a metal with a real if ambiguous name in Orichalcum. Strip away the explicit philosophical framing surrounding all these details, read the Critias in isolation, without the Timaeus' opening scene establishing exactly why Critias is telling this story in the first place, and what remains reads remarkably like a historical account rather than an illustrative myth, especially to readers encountering it in translation, centuries removed from the intellectual context in which Plato originally wrote. Roman-era readers inherited this same ambiguity and, if anything, deepened it further. Some ancient geographers speculated about lost lands in the Atlantic more generally, drawing loosely on Plato's account alongside older, independent Greek traditions of islands and paradises located somewhere beyond the known world's edges, traditions that existed before Plato and that his Atlantis story likely drew upon and gave new, more specific shape to, rather than inventing the underlying lost paradise beyond the seed concept entirely from nothing. This matters because it points to something this account will keep circling back to. Plato didn't simply invent the appeal of Atlantis from a blank page. He gave a compelling, specific, memorable shape to a much older and much broader human fascination, the idea of a golden age, an advanced or blessed civilization existing somewhere beyond the visible horizon, lost to catastrophe or simply lost to time, a fascination this account will examine more directly in a later chapter, once it has traced the myth's actual journey through the intervening centuries. For much of the medieval period, interest in Atlantis specifically receded rather than growing, overshadowed by other, more theologically central lost world narratives, the biblical account of Eden, the story of Noah's flood, and various local legends of sunken cities that existed independently across many medieval European cultures, some connected to Atlantis only later, retroactively, once Plato's specific version became widely known again. It would take a genuine intellectual and geographic upheaval, one that dramatically expanded educated Europe's sense of what unknown lands might actually exist across the ocean, to pull Atlantis back into the center of the conversation and give it the next major chapter in its long, strange afterlife. Before this account turns to that later revival, though, there's a different and considerably more scientifically grounded thread to follow first, one that doesn't ask whether Plato's Atlantis was literally real, but instead asks a more modest and more answerable question: is there a real historical event, somewhere in the actual archaeological record, that might have given Plato, or the older traditions he likely drew upon, something concrete to work from? The leading candidate among serious archaeologists who take this question seriously at all involves a volcanic island in the Aegean Sea, a Bronze Age civilization that dominated the eastern Mediterranean for centuries and one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the last 10,000 years of human history. Sometime around 1600 BCE, with the exact date still debated among geologists and archaeologists working to reconcile radiocarbon dating with ceramic evidence, the island of Thera, known today as Santorini, in the Aegean Sea north of Crete, erupted with catastrophic force, and an event modern volcanologists rank among the most powerful eruptions of the Holocene epoch. The roughly 12,000-year period of relatively stable climate that includes the entire span of recorded human civilization. The eruption's central chamber collapsed inward as it emptied, forming a massive volcanic caldera that swallowed most of the island's original landmass, leaving behind the dramatic crescent-shaped ring of cliffs that still forms the visible outline of Santorini today, along with a scattering of smaller surrounding islets marking the caldera's outer rim. Before this catastrophic eruption, Thera hosted a thriving Bronze Age settlement at a site now called Akrotiri, closely connected culturally and economically to the great Minoan civilization centered on the nearby island of Crete, the Minoans being, at this point in the Bronze Age, the dominant maritime and trading power of the eastern Mediterranean, with elaborate multi-story palace complexes, sophisticated fresco painting, and a far-reaching trade network extending across Egypt, the Levant, and much of the Aegean world. Akrotiri itself was buried under many meters of volcanic ash during the eruption, preserving its buildings, streets, and elaborate wall paintings in extraordinary detail. A genuine Bronze Age counterpart to the famous ash-preserved ruins of Pompeii, though with one striking difference: unlike Pompeii, archaeologists working at Akrotiri since systematic excavation began in 1967, led by the Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos, have found no human skeletons at all among the ruins, strongly suggesting that Akrotiri's population, unlike the residents of Pompeii nearly 2,000 years later, had sufficient warning, likely from a series of preliminary earthquakes and smaller eruptive tremors in the days or weeks beforehand, to evaluate before the catastrophic final eruption struck. The suggestion that this specific eruption inspired, however indirectly, the Atlantis legend actually predates Akrotiri's excavation by several decades. As early as 1909, the British classicist K.T. Frost proposed, in a piece published in the London Times, that the sudden and mysterious decline of Minoan civilization might connect to a lost tradition eventually reflected, in distorted and much transformed form, in Plato's Atlantis story. A Bronze Age maritime superpower, wealthy, technologically advanced for its era, undone by sudden natural catastrophe. Marinatos himself picked up and developed this idea independently in 1939, decades before his own excavations at Akrotiri would give the theory its most vivid archaeological support, and the connection has remained one of the most widely discussed, if far from universally accepted, theories about a possible real-world inspiration behind Plato's invented island. It's worth being careful and precise here, because the Thera-Minoan theory occupies a genuinely different category of claim than the pseudo-historical Atlantis theories this account will examine in a later chapter. It is not a claim that Atlantis literally existed as Plato described it, but a considerably more modest hypothesis that a real Bronze Age catastrophe, filtered and transformed through many centuries of oral tradition before ever reaching Plato's ears in whatever fragmentary form it did, may have supplied some of the raw material, a wealthy island civilization, a sudden and total natural disaster, a once great maritime power vanishing seemingly overnight, that Plato then reshaped into his own, quite different, philosophical story. Even scholars sympathetic to this theory are generally careful to frame it this way, as a plausible distant echo rather than a direct historical source. The theory does face serious, substantive objections, and a fair account of it needs to include them clearly rather than passing over them quietly. The geography is difficult to reconcile. Plato places Atlantis firmly beyond the Pillars of Heracles, out in the Atlantic Ocean, while Thera and Crete sit entirely within the Mediterranean, thousands of miles from Gibraltar in the opposite direction. The chronology poses an even larger obstacle. Plato's stated date of roughly 9600 BCE for the war between Atlantis and ancient Athens sits about 8,000 years before the Thera eruption, an enormous gap that some proponents of the theory attempt to bridge by suggesting that Plato's stated figure of 9,000 years actually represents an error, either in the ancient transmission of the story or in the interpretation of the Egyptian numerical record Solon supposedly consulted, possibly resulting from a symbol originally meaning 900 being misread or mistranslated as 9,000 somewhere along the chain of retelling. This is a genuinely speculative fix, one most Egyptologists and classicists do not find convincing, and it should be flagged clearly as speculation rather than established correction, since popular retellings of the Thera theory sometimes presented with far more confidence than the underlying evidence actually supports. Even the eruption's own date remains a live scientific controversy in its own right, and understanding it helps explain how much uncertainty still surrounds this whole subject even at the purely geological level, well before Atlantis enters the discussion. Radiocarbon dating of an olive branch found buried beneath the Thera ash, along with matching ice core evidence from Greenland recording a major global volcanic signal, points to an eruption date somewhere in the neighborhood of 1620 to 1600 BCE. Traditional archaeological dating, based instead on comparing the Rand pottery styles to well-established Egyptian historical chronology, has long favored a somewhat later date, closer to 1500 BCE. The roughly century-long gap between these two dating methods has never been fully resolved to the satisfaction of specialists on both sides, and it stands as a useful reminder that even the best-supported scientific candidate for a real-world Atlantis inspiration still carries genuine, unresolved uncertainty at its very foundation. There is also a real scholarly debate, separate from the Atlantis question entirely, about how much damage the Thera eruption actually did to Minoan civilization on Crete itself, and how directly that damage connects to the Minoan world's eventual decline. Crete sits roughly 70 miles south of Thera, far enough that while the eruption certainly caused significant regional disruption, tsunami damage along Crete's northern coastline, a period of ashfall likely disrupting agriculture in the eruption's immediate aftermath, and probable serious damage to Minoan shipping and trade in the surrounding years. The archaeological evidence shows Minoan civilization on Crete continuing largely intact for roughly another century and a half after the eruption, with its major palace complexes still functioning and its distinctive art and architecture still flourishing well into the following century. The Minoan world's actual final collapse, marked by widespread destruction of its major palace sites, is now more securely dated to around 1450 BCE, a full century or more after Thera erupted, and is generally attributed by most archaeologists primarily to the rise of Mycenaean Greek power on the mainland and its eventual takeover of Crete, rather than to any single direct consequence of the volcanic eruption itself. None of this rules out the eruption as one genuine contributing factor among several in a longer, more gradual Minoan decline. A serious regional catastrophe striking a civilization already under mounting external pressure could plausibly have weakened it in ways that compounded over the following century. Even without functioning as the single decisive blow, older, simpler versions of the theory sometimes suggest. What the evidence does not support, and what a genuinely careful account has to be honest about, is any confident claim that the Thera eruption directly inspired Plato's specific, detailed Atlantis narrative, rather than possibly contributing, alongside countless other half-remembered catastrophes across the ancient world, to the much broader and much older human tradition of lost Golden Age civilizations that Plato was already drawing upon and reshaping for his own philosophical purposes. When he sat down to write the Timaeus and Critias, the Thera-Minoan theory, whatever the true extent of its explanatory power, at least engages with real geology, real archaeological dating, and real, published scientific debate about its own limitations, a courtesy that most of the other locations proposed over the years as Atlantis's true site rarely received from the people proposing them. Before turning to those specific candidates, though, it helps to understand just how thoroughly the ocean floor those candidates so often point to has actually been mapped by now, because that context makes the weakness of most of these claims considerably easier to see clearly. Systematic mapping of the deep ocean floor is a genuinely recent achievement in human history, far more recent than most people assume. The first real scientific survey of deep-sea conditions came from the British HMS Challenger expedition of 1872 to 1876. Which took laborious individual depth soundings by lowering weighted lines from the ship, one measurement at a time, across a multi-year voyage circling the globe, a heroic but extraordinarily slow method, capable of mapping only a scattered handful of individual points across an ocean covering roughly a third of the Earth's entire surface. Real, continuous mapping of the seafloor had to wait for sonar technology, developed and refined largely for submarine warfare during the two world wars, which finally allowed ships to record continuous depth profiles as they sailed rather than single isolated points. It was this sonar-based mapping, applied systematically across the post-war decades, that produced one of the most consequential scientific discoveries of the 20th century, one directly relevant to any claim about a sunken landmass in the Atlantic. Working from thousands of individual sonar traverses gathered over years, the American geologists Marie Tharp and Bruce Heezen produced, beginning in the 1950s, the first detailed maps of the Atlantic Ocean floor, and in doing so, revealed the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, an enormous underwater mountain range running down the center of the entire Atlantic basin, marking the boundary where two of the Earth's tectonic plates are actively spreading apart from one another. Tharp's mapping, initially met with considerable skepticism from colleagues unwilling to accept what it implied, became crucial supporting evidence for plate tectonics. The theory explaining how the Earth's crust is divided into large moving plates, a theory that did not achieve full scientific acceptance until the 1960s, meaning that for essentially the entire span of Atlantis speculation this account has traced so far, from Plato through the Renaissance through the Victorian era, nobody proposing a sunken Atlantic continent had access to the geological knowledge that would have told them, immediately and decisively, why their theory could not work. That knowledge is now well established and genuinely decisive. The Atlantic seafloor is not sinking or collapsing anywhere near the scale Atlantis would require. It is actively spreading apart, growing wider by roughly an inch or two each year as fresh volcanic material wells up along the mid-Atlantic ridge, meaning the Atlantic seafloor near that ridge is geologically young rather than ancient, and the ocean basin as a whole has been widening, not narrowing or swallowing land masses, throughout the entire span of human civilization and considerably longer. A landmass larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, and Critias' own description, sinking in a single day and night sometime in the last several thousand or even several tens of thousands of years, would require a geological mechanism that simply does not exist anywhere in the Atlantic basin, and that modern plate tectonics, confirmed through decades of subsequent seismic, magnetic, and satellite evidence, rules out with about as much confidence as any claim in Earth science currently allows. None of this means the ocean floor has nothing genuine to offer archaeology. Real submerged sites do exist, and are found through careful, patient underwater excavation rather than wishful satellite gazing. The Bronze Age town of Pavlopetri, off the southern coast of Greece, sits a few meters underwater, gradually submerged over millennia by genuine, well-documented, gradual coastal subsidence rather than sudden catastrophe, and remains among the oldest known submerged town sites anywhere in the world. Doggerland, the once dry expanse of land connecting Britain to continental Europe during the last ice age, was slowly drowned by rising sea levels over thousands of years as glaciers melted, a process modern researchers have mapped in considerable detail using seafloor sediment cores and preserved organic material dredged up by fishing trawlers. Real, substantial, well-evidenced land loss, but land loss unfolding across millennia rather than a single night, and identified through patient scientific reconstruction rather than a philosopher's 4-page description written 2,000 years after the fact. By the early 21st century, international projects including the General Bathymetric Chart of the Oceans, combining ship-based sonar surveys with satellite altimetry data capable of detecting subtle variations in sea surface height caused by seafloor terrain far below, had mapped the overwhelming majority of the world's ocean floor in reasonable detail, closing in on a genuinely complete picture of the planet's entire underwater terrain. There is, at this point, no remaining unmapped region of the Atlantic large enough to hide an undiscovered continent, sunken or otherwise. Their persistence, given everything modern oceanography has established, deserves a direct look, less because any of these locations hold up under scrutiny, and more because their staying power says something important about how badly people want this particular mystery to resolve into a discoverable, verifiable place. Southern Spain has attracted repeated attention, most notably through claims connecting Atlantis to the marshlands of the Diana National Park, near the mouth of the Guadalquivir River, an area that does contain genuine archaeological remains of Tartessos, a real and historically documented Iron Age civilization that flourished in the region and traded extensively with Phoenician and Greek merchants. A 2011 documentary production, working with researchers using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, identified what its investigators described as concentric ring-shaped structures beneath the marshland and proposed a connection to Atlantis's own concentric geography, a claim that generated considerable media attention at the time, though independent archaeologists reviewing the same evidence have generally found it far more consistent with known Tartessian settlement patterns, or with entirely natural geological formations, than with anything resembling Plato's fully invented island. The waters near Bimini, in the Bahamas, offer perhaps the most famous modern Atlantis claim, centered on an underwater rock formation known as the Bimini Road, a roughly half-mile line of large, flat limestone blocks discovered in 1968, arranged with enough apparent regularity that some observers immediately proposed it as a man-made road or wall, part of a submerged Atlantean structure. The timing carried particular weight for believers, since the American psychic Edgar Cayce, whose own extensive claims about Atlantis this account will examine in a later chapter, had, decades earlier, predicted that evidence of Atlantis would resurface near Bimini around 1968 or 1969. Geologists who have studied the formation since, however, generally identify it as a naturally occurring beach rock formation, created through an entirely ordinary process in which shoreline sediment cements together in horizontal layers and later cracks along natural fault lines into the roughly rectangular blocks visible today. A phenomenon documented at numerous other beach rock sites around the world that no one has proposed as lost cities. Cyprus and Malta have each attracted their own smaller circles of Atlantis proponents, generally pointing to genuine and impressive prehistoric monuments. Malta's remarkable megalithic temples among the oldest freestanding stone structures in the world, and its underground hypogeum burial complex, as evidence of a lost advanced civilization, even though the archaeological dating and cultural context of these genuinely remarkable Neolithic sites is reasonably well understood on its own terms, without requiring any connection to Plato's invented island. Antarctica, more recently, has become a favored location among some fringe theorists who point to the continent's ice-free appearance on certain unusual historical maps as evidence of a warmer, habitable past, a claim resting on serious misreadings of both cartographic history and Antarctic geology, since credible ice core and geological evidence places the continent's ice sheet formation many millions of years before any human civilization, Atlantean or otherwise, could plausibly have existed there. It's worth pausing here on a genuine, well-documented ancient event that Atlantis theorists sometimes invoke, since it shows the difference between a real sunken city and Plato's invented one with unusual clarity. In 373 BCE, the prosperous Greek city of Helike, on the northern coast of the Peloponnese, was struck by a severe earthquake and an accompanying tsunami that submerged the city beneath the waters of the Corinthian Gulf, an event described by several ancient Greek writers, including Aristotle himself, as a genuine catastrophe within living memory rather than distant legend. Modern marine archaeologists have since located substantial submerged remains consistent with ancient Helike, confirming the core of the ancient account. Some Atlantis proponents have suggested Helike's real, documented destruction may have lent Plato's invented catastrophe an added layer of plausibility for his original Athenian audience, familiar as they likely were with the story of a genuine city swallowed by sudden natural disaster within recent historical memory. What Helike demonstrates clearly, though, is exactly the scale of difference between a real submerged Greek city and Plato's Atlantis, a single coastal settlement, modest in size, destroyed by a documented and geologically unremarkable earthquake tsunami event of a kind the Mediterranean world experienced periodically. Nothing remotely approaching a landmass larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, vanishing into the Atlantic in a single night. What unites nearly all of these proposed locations across such a wide range of geography and supposed evidence is a consistent and easy-to-name pattern. Each theory tends to begin not with archaeological evidence pointing toward Atlantis, but with a real, often genuinely fascinating archaeological site or natural formation, onto which the Atlantis story is then retroactively mapped, using whichever details from Plato's original account can be made to fit while quietly setting aside the many details that plainly do not. That pattern, starting from the desired conclusion and working backward to assemble supporting evidence, stands in useful contrast to a different, more sobering set of examples. Cases where a legendary lost city actually did turn out to rest on real archaeological ground, found not by wanting it badly enough, but by the considerably less glamorous work of patient evidence and careful excavation. These cases matter here because they show that the impulse driving centuries of Atlantis hunting is not, in itself, an unreasonable one. Sometimes legend really does encode a distorted memory of something real. The difference lies entirely in what it actually takes to prove that. The clearest example is Troy. For centuries, educated Europeans generally regarded Homer's account of the Trojan War and the city of Troy itself as beautiful but essentially fictional literature, a magnificent epic poem, not a historical record of an actual place. That consensus shifted dramatically after 1870, when Heinrich Schliemann, a wealthy German businessman with an amateur's passion for Homer and considerably more determination than formal archaeological training, began excavating a mound called Hizarlik on the northwestern coast of what is now Turkey, a site earlier scholars had already tentatively proposed as Troy's possible location. Schliemann's excavations, however methodologically crude by later professional standards, he is now criticized, with real justification, for damaging some of the very archaeological layers he was trying to study, revealed multiple successive layers of a real, walled Bronze Age city at the site, one of them destroyed by fire during roughly the era Greek tradition assigned to the Trojan War. This is worth being precise about, because popular retellings of Troy's rediscovery frequently overstate what it actually proved. Schliemann's dig confirmed that a real, substantial city existed at the location Greek tradition pointed to, and that it suffered violent destruction at a plausible time. It did not confirm the Iliad's gods, its 10-year siege, its wooden horse, or any of Homer's individual named heroes. Those elements remain, by the great weight of modern scholarly opinion, poetic invention and elaboration layered onto whatever genuine, much smaller-scale historical conflict may have originally inspired the tradition, probably centuries before Homer's own lifetime, passed down and steadily transformed through generations of oral poetry before ever being written down. Troy shows a legend can point towards something real. It does not show that everything the legend claims about that real place is equally true, a distinction this account has kept returning to throughout, and one worth applying just as carefully here. A second, more recent example comes from the Arabian Peninsula. Ubar, sometimes called the Atlantis of the Sands in modern press coverage, was a legendary trading city mentioned in Arabian oral tradition and in the Quran, said to have been destroyed for the arrogance and greed of its people, a moral structure not unlike the one driving Atlantis's own downfall in Critias' account. In 1992, a team of researchers working with satellite imagery from NASA's Space Shuttle program identified faint traces of ancient caravan routes in the Omani Desert, invisible from ground level but detectable from orbit, converging on a single site that excavation subsequently confirmed as a real fortified oasis settlement, considerably more modest in scale than its legendary description, which appears to have partially collapsed into a large sinkhole, likely feeding local memory of the site. Into the more dramatic story of a city swallowed by the earth as punishment. Genuine underwater archaeology, too, continues to produce real discoveries that deserve to be taken seriously on their own terms. Submerged structures off the coast of Dwarka in India, associated by some researchers and by local tradition with Hindu legendary accounts of Krishna's lost city. Though the dating and interpretation of these particular underwater remains continues to be genuinely debated among specialists, and this account will not present that identification as settled fact. What unites Troy and Ubar and separates them clearly from Atlantis is the actual mechanism of discovery, converging physical evidence, careful excavation, peer-reviewed publication, and dating methods capable of being checked and challenged by other researchers, exactly the kind of patient evidentiary work that, across more than a century of enthusiastic searching canvassed in the previous chapter, has never once turned up anything resembling Plato's Island. None of that patient, evidence-driven work has ever produced anything resembling Atlantis, which is exactly why the myth's next major chapter unfolds not in an excavation trench, but in the libraries and printing houses of Renaissance Europe, where an old philosophical fable collided with an entirely new and genuinely disorienting geographic reality. For roughly 1,000 years following the fall of the Western Roman Empire, as the previous chapters of this account already noted, Atlantis remained a relatively minor thread within European intellectual life, known chiefly to scholars with direct access to Plato's original texts, most of which survived through the medieval period primarily via Byzantine and, later, Arabic and renewed Latin translation traditions, rather than through wide, popular circulation. That changed decisively with two connected developments: the broader European rediscovery of classical Greek philosophy during the Renaissance, and, arriving at almost exactly the same historical moment, Europe's sudden, disorienting encounter with an entire hemisphere of previously unknown lands across the Atlantic Ocean. The timing here is worth sitting with, because it explains so much of what follows. Christopher Columbus's 1492 voyage and the flood of exploration that followed it across the 16th century landed on educated European readers at precisely the moment when Plato's works, Atlantis included, were becoming widely available again in fresh translations and increasingly influential editions. Suddenly, a philosopher's 2,400-year-old description of a vast, wealthy landmass lying beyond the Pillars of Heracles, out in the Atlantic Ocean, no longer read as pure invented fantasy to many readers. It read, to some at least, like a startlingly prescient anticipation of the very real continents Europeans were now discovering for themselves. Several Spanish and Portuguese chroniclers of the 16th century speculated, with varying degrees of seriousness, that the newly encountered Americas might themselves be Atlantis, or a surviving fragment of it, a theory that carried obvious rhetorical convenience for European powers eager to frame their arrival in the Americas as a rediscovery of ancient, half-remembered territory rather than a straightforward conquest of lands already inhabited by peoples with their own long, independent histories. This same intellectual moment produced what may be the single most influential and most clarifying episode in Atlantis's entire post-Plato history. At least for understanding how the story's cultural function had shifted, Francis Bacon's unfinished work New Atlantis, composed in the early 1620s and published posthumously in 1627. Bacon, one of the founding figures of the modern scientific method, used the framework of an invented island, explicitly borrowing Plato's device of a lost or hidden land beyond the known world, to imagine a fictional utopian society called Ben Salem, organized around a research institution called Salomon's House, dedicated to the systematic pursuit of scientific knowledge for the benefit of humanity. Bacon's New Atlantis would go on to directly influence the founding, decades later, of Britain's Royal Society, one of the world's first and most influential scientific institutions. What makes Bacon's work so genuinely useful for understanding Atlantis's broader story is how transparently and how confidently he treated the entire premise as pure literary device. Nobody reading New Atlantis in the 17th century mistook it for a factual travel account, and Bacon clearly never intended it as one. He was doing, quite deliberately, exactly what Plato had done nearly 2,000 years earlier, using an invented lost island as a vessel for exploring an idea. In Bacon's case, the transformative potential of organized scientific inquiry, rather than making any claim about actual geography or history. For a brief window during the Renaissance, in other words, Atlantis briefly returned to something close to its original literary function, even as, running in parallel and often in the very same intellectual circles, other readers were increasingly inclined to take Plato's original account far more literally than Bacon ever took his own homage to it. That tension, between Atlantis as deliberate metaphor and Atlantis as hidden literal truth, would only grow sharper and stranger as the story entered its most transformative century yet. If the Renaissance saw Atlantis reclaimed, briefly, as a self-aware literary device, the 19th century did almost precisely the opposite. It saw Atlantis transformed, more thoroughly and more consequentially than at any point since Plato's own lifetime, into something millions of readers were prepared to accept as literal, verifiable historical fact, with real and sometimes genuinely troubling consequences for how the story would go on to be used. The turning point arrived in 1882, with the publication of a book by an unlikely author, Ignatius Donnelly, a former United States Congressman from Minnesota, amateur scholar, and gifted popular writer, whose book Atlantis, The Antediluvian World became an immediate bestseller and one of the most influential works of pseudo-archaeology ever published. Donnelly's central argument went considerably further than anything Plato himself had claimed. He proposed, at length and with an impressive if entirely uncritical marshalling of comparative evidence, that Atlantis had not merely existed, but had served as the original source civilization for essentially all subsequent human culture, that the striking similarities between ancient Egyptian and Mesoamerican pyramid building, for instance, or between flood myths found across widely separated cultures around the world, could best be explained not by independent human societies arriving at broadly similar solutions to broadly similar problems, as mainstream archaeology has since firmly established through extensive independent evidence, but by a shared Atlantean origin, with survivors of the island's destruction fanning out across the globe and seeding civilization wherever they landed. This idea, sometimes called hyperdiffusionism among historians of pseudo-archaeology, proved enormously appealing to Victorian readers already primed by their own era's fascination with ancient mysteries and lost civilizations, and Donnelly's book went through numerous editions and remained continuously in print for well over a century, shaping nearly every subsequent popular treatment of Atlantis that followed it, whether or not later writers ever directly credited him. Donnelly's diffusionist Atlantis fed directly into an even more ambitious and more explicitly spiritual reworking of the myth, arriving via the theosophical movement founded by the Russian-born writer and mystic Helena Blavatsky. In her 1888 work The Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky incorporated Atlantis into an elaborate, entirely esoteric cosmological framework describing humanity's supposed spiritual evolution through a succession of root races, with the Atlanteans positioned as an advanced fourth root race, possessing what she described as extraordinary psychic and technological capabilities, preceding the present fifth root race she considered modern humanity to represent. Blavatsky's Atlantis existed alongside a companion lost continent, Lemuria, and a mythology explicitly presented as spiritual revelation rather than historical scholarship, a framework later expanded further by figures including Rudolf Steiner, a former theosophist who went on to found his own related spiritual movement, Anthroposophy, and who wrote extensively about his own visionary account of Atlantean civilization and its supposed technologies. It's important to be direct and precise about what happened next, because this is the point in Atlantis's long history where an entirely invented ancient myth intersected with one of the 20th century's genuine historical horrors, and that intersection deserves careful, factual treatment rather than either sensationalized emphasis or quiet omission. During the 1930s and into the Second World War, the Ahnenerbe, a pseudo-scientific research institute established in 1935 under the direction of Heinrich Himmler, head of the Nazi SS, sponsored a range of expeditions and publications aimed at manufacturing a fabricated ancient pedigree for Nazi racial ideology, seeking supposed archaeological evidence of an ancient, superior Aryan or Nordic race whose achievements had, in this invented framework, been unjustly forgotten or suppressed by history. Some figures associated with this project, including the amateur prehistorian Hermann Wirth, incorporated versions of the Atlantis myth, sometimes blended. In the loose and inconsistent way pseudo-historical movements often combine unrelated mythologies with the separate legendary northern land of Thule into this fabricated racial narrative, presenting a lost Atlantic or northern homeland as the supposed original source of Aryan civilization and superiority. The Ahnenerbe's activities extended well beyond any single lost continent theory, underscoring just how extensive and how absurd this pseudo-scientific apparatus actually became once state power and resources were behind it. In 1938 and 1939, the Institute funded and organized an expedition to Tibet, led by the zoologist Ernst Schaefer, ostensibly for scientific research but substantially motivated by the same racial mythology driving the Institute's Atlantis and Thule speculation, a search for supposed remnants of an ancient, racially pure population believed, within this invented framework, to have preserved traces of humanity's original Aryan homeland. The expedition returned with genuine zoological and ethnographic specimens alongside a great deal of ideologically motivated pseudo-scientific interpretation, and its existence is well documented in surviving German archives and photographs, offering a clear and disturbing illustration of how far actual government resources were willing to travel in pursuit of a fabricated ancient pedigree with no genuine historical or archaeological basis whatsoever. This history is worth stating plainly, without embellishment. Mainstream archaeology and history reject this entire framework as complete fabrication, resting on no genuine archaeological or historical evidence whatsoever, constructed specifically to serve a racist political ideology that would go on to justify genocide. Its significance for this account lies less in what it claims to reveal about any actual ancient civilization, since it reveals nothing of the kind, and considerably more in what it demonstrates about the myth of Atlantis itself, a story invented by a philosopher to argue that unchecked wealth and power corrupt even the most gifted civilizations proved, 22 centuries later, disturbingly easy to invert and weaponize into precisely the kind of self-flattering myth of inherited racial superiority that Plato's own philosophy, taken seriously, would have found genuinely repugnant. A story with no basis in historical fact, this episode makes clear, can still cause very real historical harm once enough people decide to believe it or find it politically useful to pretend they do. By the early 20th century, Atlantis had accumulated so many layers of reinterpretation, philosophical allegory, diffusionist pseudo-history, esoteric spiritual cosmology, and, in its darkest turn, ideological weapon, that it had become, in effect, a kind of open cultural template, a story flexible enough that almost any writer, prophet, or entertainer could reshape it to fit whatever purpose they had in mind. Few individuals illustrate this flexibility more vividly than the American psychic Edgar Cayce, sometimes called the sleeping prophet, who delivered, across several decades until his death in 1945, hundreds of trance readings in which he claimed to access hidden knowledge about a wide range of subjects, Atlantis prominent among them. Cayce's Atlantis, delivered through these trance sessions to clients and stenographers rather than through any traditional written scholarship, described a civilization possessing advanced technology built around crystal-based energy sources, capable of powers well beyond anything Plato's original account ever suggested, destroyed not by the single natural catastrophe Critias describes, but by a series of cataclysms connected, and Cayce's telling, to the misuse of that same crystal technology. Cayce further predicted that portions of Atlantis would rise again and become discoverable near Bimini, in the Bahamas, around 1968 or 1969. A prediction his followers connected directly to the 1968 discovery of the Bimini Road Formation this account examined in an earlier chapter, even though, as that chapter noted, mainstream geological analysis identifies the formation as a natural beach rock structure rather than any kind of resurfaced Atlantean architecture. Alongside these more explicitly mystical strands, Atlantis simultaneously flourished, with far less pretense to literal truth, as pure entertainment across nearly every popular medium of the modern era. The trend actually predates Donnelly's supposedly non-fiction bestseller by more than a decade. Jules Verne's 1870 novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea includes a memorable scene in which Captain Nemo leads his guests on a nighttime walk through the genuine submerged ruins of Atlantis, glimpsed by torchlight on the ocean floor, a passage Verne wrote purely as imaginative fiction, with no claim to literal geographic accuracy, but one that helped fix the image of Atlantis as a physically visitable, walkable ruin in the popular imagination well before Donnelly's book arrived to argue that such a place had actually existed. Early adventure fiction continued the trend into the new century, including the French writer Pierre Benoit's widely translated 1919 novel L'Atlantide, which imagined hidden Atlantean survivors and lost desert kingdoms in the spirit of the era's broader fascination with exploration and hidden worlds. American comic books picked up the thread soon after, most notably with the DC Comics character Aquaman, whose underwater Atlantean kingdom, first appearing in 1941, has remained a fixture of mainstream superhero storytelling for over 80 years since. Later decades brought Atlantis to animated feature film, most prominently in Disney's 2001 production Atlantis, The Lost Empire, and to countless video games, novels, and television specials, each adapting the core elements this account has traced across 24 centuries: the lost island, the advanced civilization, the sudden catastrophic fall, into whatever narrative shape suited the medium and moment. This entertainment-driven proliferation exists alongside, and sometimes blurs directly into, a persistent thread of modern pseudo-archaeological media, documentaries, cable television specials, and online content that continues to present various Atlantis theories with a confident tone of suppressed or forgotten truth, often borrowing credibility from the genuine archaeological methods of programs covering real historical sites while applying none of that method's actual evidentiary standards to their own Atlantis claims. The persistence of this pattern, across a century of shifting media technology, from Donnelly's Victorian bestseller through Casey's trance readings to modern streaming documentaries, suggests something important. The appetite driving Atlantis's continual reinvention was never really about the specific island Plato described at all. It was, and remains, about something considerably larger and more universally human, a question this account is finally ready to address directly. After tracing Atlantis across 24 centuries of reinterpretation, from philosophical allegory to failed utopia, from diffusionist pseudo-history to spiritual cosmology, from weaponized racial myth to psychic prophecy to summer blockbuster, it's worth finally asking the question this account has been circling from its very first chapter. Why does this particular invented story, more than nearly any other piece of ancient literature, refuse to be received simply as the philosophical fiction its own author almost certainly intended? The answer, as far as historians of myth and folklore can trace it, has less to do with anything specific to Plato's actual text, and considerably more to do with a much older and much broader human narrative pattern that Atlantis simply happened to give an unusually vivid, specific, and memorable shape. Long before Plato ever wrote a word, the Greek poet Hesiod, writing sometime around 700 BCE in his work Works and Days, described human history as a sequence of declining ages. A golden age of ease and abundance under the rule of the god Cronus, followed by successively worse silver, bronze, and heroic ages, down to Hesiod's own Iron Age, which he characterized as a time of toil, injustice, and diminished human capacity compared to what had supposedly come before. This pattern, a perfect or near-perfect past, followed by decline into a lesser present, appears independently across an enormous range of human cultures and belief systems. From the Hindu concept of declining yugas to countless indigenous oral traditions worldwide describing ancestors possessing greater wisdom, greater harmony with the natural world, or greater spiritual power than people living in the storyteller's own time. It is, in other words, one of the most widespread narrative structures human societies have ever produced, and Atlantis, with its vivid description of a civilization possessing every imaginable advantage before losing everything through its own moral failure, slots almost perfectly into this pre-existing, deeply familiar template. A related and similarly ancient pattern runs through flood myths specifically, found across an equally wide range of separated cultures. The Mesopotamian flood narrative preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh and its older Sumerian antecedents, the Hebrew Bible's account of Noah, and the Greek tradition of Deucalion, each describing a catastrophic flood that destroys a corrupted or overcrowded earlier world, sparing only a small remnant to begin again. This same flood narrative pattern extends well beyond the Mediterranean and Near Eastern traditions already mentioned. Aztec tradition describes a sequence of 5 successive worlds or suns, each ending in a different form of cataclysm, including one iteration destroyed by an all-consuming flood from which only a single couple survived, transformed into fish to endure the waters. Chinese tradition preserves a notably different variation on the same basic threat, the legendary flood tamed not through divine destruction and a chosen remnant, but through the patient engineering work of you the Great, who succeeded, according to tradition, where his father's earlier attempt to dam and block the floodwaters had failed, by instead digging channels to guide the water safely to the sea. A flood myth built around human ingenuity and hydraulic engineering rather than divine. Judgment and survival. Hindu tradition, meanwhile, preserves the story of Manu, warned of an approaching deluge by a fish that grows to enormous size, later identified and developed Hindu theology as an avatar of the god Vishnu, instructing Manu to build a boat and gather the seeds of all living things before the flood arrives, a narrative structure bearing an obvious family resemblance to the Mesopotamian and Hebrew flood accounts already discussed, despite arising within an entirely separate religious and cultural tradition. Most scholars of comparative mythology regard these flood traditions as arising largely independently of one another, likely reflecting the simple fact that flooding represented a genuinely common and genuinely catastrophic natural threat across many ancient river valley and coastal societies, rather than evidence of a single shared historical memory of one global flood event, though popular pseudo-historical treatments frequently, and misleadingly, collapse these independently arising traditions into a single unified ancient global catastrophe narrative, with Atlantis often inserted as that catastrophe's central casualty. Layered on top of these ancient narrative patterns sits a more modern psychological pull, one that helps explain why Atlantis specifically, rather than any of the dozens of other lost civilization myths documented across world folklore, achieved such outsized and durable cultural prominence. The appeal, to a great many readers across many different eras, of forbidden or suppressed knowledge, the comforting, exciting idea that official institutions, whether ancient priesthoods or modern academic archaeology, are either unable or unwilling to acknowledge some larger, more extraordinary truth about human history that a sufficiently determined outsider might still uncover. This same psychological structure underlies a great deal of modern conspiracy thinking well beyond Atlantis specifically, and Atlantis, with its genuine philosophical pedigree, its aura of ancient authority borrowed from Plato's own towering reputation, and its concrete, specific, endlessly arguable details, has functioned for well over a century as one of that broader impulse's most durable and most respectable seeming vehicles. Look back now across everything this account has traced, and a clear pattern emerges, one considerably stranger, in its own way, than the sunken continent most people picture when they hear the word Atlantis. A philosopher in 4th century Athens invented an island to make an argument about virtue, wealth, and the fragility of even the most gifted civilizations when they lose sight of what actually sustains them. He never finished the story. He may never have intended anyone to read it as literal history at all. And yet, generation after generation, readers took that unfinished philosophical sketch and remade it into whatever their own era most needed it to be. A geography lesson for an age of exploration discovering entire unknown continents, a founding myth for Victorian pseudoscience convinced that all human achievement traced back to one lost superior source, a spiritual cosmology for occultists seeking hidden ancient wisdom, a fabricated pedigree for one of history's most murderous ideologies, a prophecy for a trance-channeling mystic, and finally, in the century since, a nearly inexhaustible wellspring of entertainment, requiring no belief at all beyond the pleasure of a good story well told. What's genuinely remarkable, looking at this whole span at once, is how little the island itself ever actually mattered, compared to what each era needed it to represent. Plato's Atlantis was never really about geography, any more than the Republic's ideal city was ever really a blueprint for an actual government to build. It was about the gap between what a civilization possesses and what a civilization deserves, about the particular, recurring human tragedy of societies that gain everything material and lose, in the process, whatever quieter virtue had made them worth admiring in the first place. That argument didn't need Atlantis to be real in order to work. It needed Atlantis to be vivid, specific, and memorable enough that the lesson would outlast the fine print explaining it was only ever a story, and on exactly that count, whatever else you conclude about Plato's intentions, his invention succeeded almost too well. Perhaps that's the truest thing this whole long journey through the legend can leave you with, as you finally let it go and let the rest of the night take you where it will. Some stories are told so vividly, and touch something so persistent in how people already want to understand their own history, that being fiction stops mattering to the audience almost as soon as the telling ends. Atlantis was never lost, because it was never anywhere to begin with. But the desire it answers, for a golden age, for a civilization worth mourning, for proof that greatness and downfall are written into the same story, that desire is real and old, and shows no sign of settling beneath the waves anytime soon. Rest now, and let the rest of what you carry from tonight simply be that, not an answer, but a question worth sitting with quietly, as sleep finally comes to claim you.